Hello and welcome to another episode of Bastion Academy. Bastion Academy is a podcast series that explores everything to do with human physiology and gives you tips on exercise, nutrition, and lifestyle interventions that you can immediately apply to your life to improve your life and overall optimize your human performance. How this podcast works is it's meant to be purely audio-based, so you can understand and digest all the material here just by listening to it. However, I do have slides that I will be scrolling through, so if you are more of a visual learner or want to pull this up on a screen, feel free to do so. There are some graphs and visuals that might be helpful to understand the material a bit better. And today's episode will be on how to eat in a consumerist world. The word consumerist might raise some eyebrows, but essentially what I mean here is just our overall propensity as a human race and species to strive for more, to want more, and how that shows up in a lot of our economical and societal structures. So to get started, what you will learn in this podcast is number one, how simple proper nutrition really is. I think a lot of us overcomplicate it, and especially with the internet and social media, that tends to overcomplicate it as well. By the end of this podcast, this is one thing I really want to get down in your head is that nutrition really is simple. Two, what proper nutrition does to your health and outcomes. We'll briefly explore why nutrition is important and how it's important to your health. Three is why modern eating specifically feels so difficult nowadays. Four is how culture and government regulations really affect our eating behavior without us really realizing it and how it really influences our decisions subconsciously. Five is why fad diets exist and how the cycle works. There's always a new diet like keto or carnivore. And there's always a cycle of diets or new foods to avoid or to incorporate in our diets. And we'll kind of try to explore why that happens and why it will always be the case that there's some new diet to follow. And number six is we'll discuss the few scientific truths of a good diet that you can immediately start applying to your life. So first and foremost, nutrition really is simple. There's one thing I want you to understand and get away from this podcast is that nutrition is not complex. And I think a lot of social media, marketing, the internet has really led us to believe that it's way more complicated than it really is. But we do have a lot of great data on nutrition and what good nutrition looks like nowadays. And it's pretty much set in stone at this point. So to think about nutrition, I think it's very helpful to first think about it historically. What did nutrition look like before modern times? There was low processing. Foods were not made in factories. It was a lot of single ingredient whole foods. Food was scarce. It was high effort. So it took a long time to prepare food. It took a lot of effort to find food. And even seasoning was rare. We didn't really have salt, spices, herbs, dressings, condiments to be putting on our food to make it taste better. Eating was really just a survival tool. It was pretty bland, boring, and just a necessity. And so nowadays, the environment is kind of engineered against our biology. And it's not really done intentionally. I think it's a result of modern technology and capitalism. While they can be very helpful, they have made food way too accessible, way too convenient, and highly processed. And that just doesn't work well with our human biology at all. And it shows in the statistics. As you can see on this graph, since 1975, obesity rose from 11% to 40% in 2020. That is a 30% increase in only a few decades. And that really means it's not a willpower or discipline issue. It's a systems issue. Again, capitalism and modern technology made foods way too accessible, and now food is overly abundant. It's very low effort, so the exact opposite of what it used to be in nature historically. There's tons of processing, and it's very convenient to eat nowadays. They're packaged in neatly packaged wrappers. They're made to have a very soft texture. There's lots of liquid calories out there that are made to be eaten on the go. And, inherently capitalism rewards consumerism. The more you can get someone to consume a product, the more a product sells. Capitalism rewards that. And so more is better in the capitalistic mindset. But as we can see from many different examples, it's definitely not always better, especially when it comes to our health. And so now we have more access to food, but now decision fatigue hits way harder. Decision fatigue is kind of all the decisions that add up on a daily basis that really exhaust your mental energy. And nowadays, more than ever, we have so many decisions. We're hit with hundreds, if not thousands, of daily decisions. Even just on our one phone, we have a device that we open up in the morning, and there's tons of notifications and different options that we can go about on our phone. And we're immediately hit with a potential of hundreds of decisions just with the device in our hand. And so this decision fatigue bleeds over into our nutritional decisions, making nutritional decisions feel harder as well. And so we have a massive trade-off for the first time in our human evolution, which is very heavy and serious to consider. It's that we've essentially traded fast technological advancement for our health. So really, discipline is not the issue with nutrition. It is nowadays in a sense, but it really is the environment and systems around you. And being aware of these environment and systems can be very helpful. And also just constructing your own environment, such as your home, your kitchen, can be very helpful for taming your cravings, your appetite, and just overall regulating your weight without having to think much about it. So if you feel nutrition is complex, this is why, but it really is quite simple, and we're going to talk about this later on. So first and foremost, what does proper nutrition and health do? What does nutrition do to the body? So the overall goal of nutrition, how you can think about this, is you want to eat food that releases energy or calories slowly and gives you stable blood sugar. We want to avoid unstable blood sugar that has very high lows and very low lows. And we want to ultimately have blood sugar that is pretty steady throughout the entire day. The more unstable your blood sugar is, the more unstable your mood is, the more unstable your energy is, and the more erratic your cravings and appetite will be. And this is really a result of eating foods that are really high in calories, high in sugar, high in carbohydrates. Sugar and carbohydrates are not necessarily the enemy, but it is really easy to overconsume those types of foods, which is what leads to unstable blood sugar in the first place. And everything you eat causes acute cellular stress and damage. Everything. That includes vegetables. So eating is naturally an inflammatory, damaging process. And our goal is to try and eat food that contains antioxidants and nutrients that kind of neutralize that damaging process. So things like vegetables, fiber, the antioxidants that are present in vegetables or fruits help minimize and neutralize that damage, which is why they're so good for you. And so nutrition affects the body in a lot of different ways, but I think four core ways that are really helpful to think about is number one, mainly to impact your metabolic health a ton. And your metabolic health impacts everything about your health. So what is metabolic health? It's essentially how well does your body's cells utilize energy efficiently? How healthy are your cells? How responsive are they to the insulin? Insulin, you can kind of think of, it's a molecule or hormone that is created by your pancreas, and it's essentially a key to a lock. Your cells essentially are locked up, and when insulin comes by, it acts as a little key, opens up the cell door, and allows glucose to flood into the cell to be utilized for energy. And how well your body and cells respond to insulin in that process is an indication of how sensitive to insulin you are and how sensitive you are to nutrients. And diabetes is one of the core diseases that result in insulin resistance and a lack of ability to use insulin and nutrients effectively. Mitochondrial health is kind of secondary to metabolic health. Mitochondria are found in pretty much every cell in the body, and they convert food into ATP, which is the main energy currency or source that your body uses for literally every process in the body. And whenever you eat bad foods, whenever you're chronically inflamed, overeating, or have unstable blood sugar for long periods of time, that causes mitochondrial dysfunction. And mitochondrial dysfunction is a hallmark of aging. Chronic malnutrition impairs mitochondrial function, and this manifests as aging, as fatigue, and age. Also, brain health, massively impacted by your nutrition. A lot of neurotransmitters like dopamine or serotonin, the very things that help you feel energized or happy or goal-driven or content or calm and allow you to get out of bed every morning, those neurotransmitters are synthesized from dietary precursors. So protein is broken down into amino acids, and amino acids, tyrosine and tryptophan, are precursors to dopamine and serotonin. There's a lot of neurotransmitters, a lot of neuromodulators in their system, but those are two great examples of how our body really relies on what we eat. And also there's a gut-brain axis. This is very well established in literature. Our microbiome and overall digestive health plays a huge role into how important or how healthy our brain is. Our gut and brain communicate with one another essentially through the vagal nerve, and how healthy your digestive system, how diverse your microbiome is with gut bacteria really determines how satiated you feel from food and even impacts your mood pretty greatly. Nutrition can also worsen or improve cancer risk. So poor metabolic health causes inflammation, and inflammation is one of the main contributions to cancer risk long-term. So this can increase risk of cancer across populations, and having a diet that is high in fiber intake, especially from plants or fruits, really does minimize inflammation, stabilizes blood sugar, and can help reduce risks of colon cancer. So that's very important. And so these three main avenues for which nutrition improves your health has a cascading effect on your overall longevity and health span. So the better you eat, the better of a human you are, the more healthy you are, the more you can accomplish, and the more you can get out of this one life that we have on earth. So why does modern eating feel so hard? There's two main reasons that I've given a lot of thought about. Number one is hyperpalatability in food engineering. So food is tastier than ever and more accessible than ever due to food engineering. There's whole groups of people and food scientists that design food to get you to overconsume it and eat too much of it. And companies invest a lot of money into this process. There is a specified bliss point in food science where it is the optimal amount of fat, sugar, and salt content that food scientists and companies and restaurants will chase after to make a food near impossible to put down. It essentially hits all of the dopamine reward pathways in the brain really optimally so that it's very hard to express any willpower discipline with. And we also know that the mouth feel of foods have a great impact, a significant impact on how filling they are to the body. Because if you don't know, we have receptors in the gut that detect a stretch, and those receptors, when they're stretched, signal to the brain that we're full. And by utilizing soft textured foods and liquid calories, that reduces satiety signals. And a lot of food scientists, food engineers will utilize this to their advantage and make foods at restaurants and candies and foods packaged as bars very tasty and ultimately less satiating, so you keep eating more of it. And so processed foods inherently bypass natural appetite regulation compared to single ingredient whole foods like plants and meats. And the tastier a food is, it produces a sharper dopamine reward response. And food, is necessary, and it does kind of have a similar biochemical response in the brain to drugs. And I want to highlight the word similar. They are not the same thing. Obviously, drugs are way more addictive, but there's a lot of discussion by scientists in the literature on how some foods can be put under the definition of addicting. And depending on how you define addiction, foods can be addicting. And so the sharper the response to this dopamine increase, the more addicting any substance is. If you don't know, drugs like alcohol or THC typically work with a dopamine response system in the brain, so it sharply increases dopamine, and there is a following sharp decrease in dopamine that makes you feel really awful and makes your brain crave it again, and that's what causes addiction to happen. And this is kind of the same kind of loop that food actually has, especially hyperpalatable or very tasty food. Hyperpalatable is just a fancy word for really, really tasty food. And so anything that has high reward biochemically in the brain with low effort and low cost, typically results in addiction. So exercise is one of those that is very rewarding to the brain, but it does require a lot of effort, it does require a lot of cost. Whereas food, you just open up a package and you start eating, and that's very low effort, low cost, but high reward. Same with drugs. You just take something and it's immediately rewarding. So over time, eating becomes automatic as a result of it being very rewarding. Also, lastly to note here is the idea that food engineer is a literal job title is a little bit concerning to me. This is a little bit ridiculous. I don't think we need food engineers in our society. That's a little bit of an extreme statement. There are some food engineers that absolutely do a great job. As an example, GMO foods, genetically modified organisms, such as like a lot of our apples and corn and a lot of our crops are actually genetically modified nowadays to make them more nutritious and to make them have more substance to them, and it can actually be beneficial for human consumption. But not all food engineers are on that side of the spectrum. A lot of food engineers are in the game to make foods more palatable and addicting to consume. Second reason outside of hyperpalatability is psychologically, marketing, consumerism use the human mind and our psychology against us. So we know that visual cues trigger appetite despite any actual hunger. Companies will use this to our advantage by making advertisements and pictures of food to make them immediately appealing to us. Packaging is designed very meticulously to signal comfort, reward, and nostalgia. Coca-Cola is a great example of this. And another great example of how marketers and companies will use this psychology to their advantage is that grocery store designs and layouts are actually very, very intentional. They will place foods in certain sections of the grocery store first when you first walk in to get you to buy them. They'll place a lot of products that sell really well, really conveniently right at eye level so that you accidentally look at them and hopefully make an impulsive decision to buy it. And any foods or products that don't sell well, they're kind of out of the way in the store. They take a long time to get to. A lot of grocery stores will place dairy, eggs, and milk at the very back of the store. So it actually forces you to go through the entire store and hopefully look at almost everything before you reach it to try and buy more things. That's actually a very intentional design and layout. And also, a recent study was published that 70% of foods at grocery stores are ultra processed in the United States. So only 30% of foods are not processed or actually whole foods, which it just makes decision making in a grocery store that much harder when the majority of your options aren't even real food. And on top of this, processed foods are low cost, they're efficient, and people keep buying it. It sells. And I went to the Ross School of Business, and it really was eye-opening the 4 years that I went there on how intentional and how meticulous companies and marketing campaigns are to get you to buy something, right? We would spend hours on working on assignments or projects on how to get an image to invoke a certain response in a consumer. What colors invoke a certain response to the consumer, and why would that make them buy the product over another? There's a great infographic here if you have a chance to pause by the Center for Nutritional Psychology. It's called Exposure to Highly Rewarding Foods Can Lead to Increased Food Intake. So this kind of shows as a visual of what we just discussed. Excess consumption of rewarding foods leads to a desensitization of the reward system. So the more palatable or tastier foods that you eat, it actually desensitizes your brain to that, and your brain gets very used to it. And so it kind of wants more and more of it. It sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Individual wants more food to eat, and that increases intake of food, which leads to overeating, and that increases body weight. So it's kind of this vicious cycle. So what is processed food anyway? Processed food has its advantages. It was designed and created for a reason. It has very long shelf life, very low cost storage, and companies love this. Capitalism loves this because it sells really well. It's very cheap to make, and freezing it, you don't have to freeze it necessarily, and it lasts a very long time. It doesn't deteriorate or rot like whole foods might. So, and they're also designed to be eaten very quickly or easily. So with any sort of business that you make, or product that you sell, you're trying to fill a gap. You're trying to solve a problem with a solution. And I guess the solution in this case, although I don't think it's necessarily a problem, is that, or the problem in this case is that food would take too much time to prepare and it was too costly. And so processed foods came into the picture. And so processed foods are cheap, they're easy to eat, you can eat them on the go, and this does apply to protein products. I think especially nowadays there are so many protein products, and a lot of companies are using this big increase in protein awareness to start marketing protein on their packaging. And this is good and bad. Protein obviously is better for you than just having like a straight Snickers bar of fat and carbs and sugar. It does make you feel more full, but it gets you stuck in the same cycle that you were originally in. Protein bars are ultra processed. And so a high protein Snickers bar, while it might be a little bit better than a regular Snickers bar, it still tastes really good. And it isn't really great for your metabolic health. So there are costs and benefits to that. So grades of processing, I highly encourage you to look at Nova's food classification system. This is drawn straight from there. There are 4 groups of processing, from unprocessed to ultra-processed foods. So group number 1 is basically unprocessed or minimally processed foods, straight meat or plants taken straight from the farm. Our minimally processed foods are essentially a removal of part of the food. So think like peanut butter or coffee, where you're grinding it down to get a substance that you like. You're not adding anything to it, but you're removing parts of it that you don't want. Group number 2 of processing is our oils, fats, sugar, and salt. And so immediately we're getting into group number 2 already with just oils, fat, sugar, and salt. I'm not saying to avoid oils, fat, sugar, and salt altogether, but it's important to note that these are processed foods and they are flavor enhancers. They used to historically not be very available to many of us, but we do use honey, oil, and butter almost all the time with every meal nowadays. And it's important to maybe limit those and have some more moderation with those than you once thought was appropriate. Group 3 for processing is true processed foods. So the use of salt, sugar, oil, or other substances added to natural or minimally processed foods to preserve or to make them more palatable. So this is pretty much most foods that you will find in a restaurant or that you make yourself, honestly. This also applies to bread, cheese, salted or sugar nuts. This actually kind of shocked me a little bit because I thought bread was, more so minimally processed, but no, it's multiple ingredients put together to make it more palatable and more convenient to eat. So bread and cheese are definitely processed foods, and they can be easy to overeat because they're extremely convenient and accessible. And finally, group number 4 are ultra processed foods. These are the absolute worst for you, and they are essentially industrial formulations synthesized in labs. They're made mostly of substances extracted from real food, not the real food itself. It's essentially fake food. Pastries, cereal, chips, juices, and even protein bars. These are all processed food. And so going back to the idea of capitalism, consumerism, it leads to industrialism, right? Because we have to meet supply with demand. If you take an economics course, in order to make the most money, you have to meet the supply with the demand. And if you, in a capitalist society, make a product that sells very well, you then have to find a way to industrialize it and make it as quickly as you possibly can to sell as much of it as you possibly can, because more money is better, right? So hyperconsumption leads to hyperindustrialism to meet demand. And so now, not only is this creating processed foods, but even whole foods are being affected by this as well. Studies point to declining vitamin and mineral content in plants. And this is because we are harvesting plants before they're ready. We're not letting the soil remineralize. We're having very high yields of plants, which dilutes the minerals in the soil. And so even organic foods are affected by this. And there's a lot of studies on this, but one study that I have pulled up here is changes in food composition for 43 garden crops from 1950 to 1999. And we can see a 9% decrease in phosphorus, a 15% decrease in iron, a 16% decrease in calcium, a 20% decrease in vitamin C, and a 38% decrease in vitamin B2. This is just one study. I've seen multiple studies that point into the same direction, that compare foods and crops historically and how their mineral and vitamin contents are decreasing over time. It's not the end of the world here, but if you can, try to buy directly from farmers markets, as these don't fall into the same category as highly organized, efficient industrial machines that a lot of farms fall into nowadays. It's not the end of the world, but we should really start getting mad about this. I think this should start to make way for some sort of regulation, reform, or change, because this is a big deal and it is getting in the way of our health. There's another great paper, and this has been replicated over and over again in scientific literature, that magnesium, especially in the United States, 50% of Americans are deficient in magnesium, and magnesium can be traced back as a essential mineral that helps prevent hundreds of diseases. It plays a part in over 300 bodily processes in the body, and it's an incredibly important mineral that we need to make sure that we're not deficient in, and 50% of us are deficient in it. And I think this is a result of, one, processed food intake that don't have these macronutrients in them, and also the decreasing mineral content in the foods that we are consuming. So how does regulation and environment play a role here? A good example is the Europe versus United States environment. Healthy food is more affordable and more accessible in Europe and other places like Japan as well. Advertising is also less in your face. I think if you live in the United States, all of us have seen those really crazy roads in a rural area, or when we're going on a road trip, where it's just advertisement after advertisement. There's so many fast food restaurants, signs sticking up. They're 100 feet tall. Burger King, Arby's, McDonald's, Starbucks, Taco Bell, just all in one place on one road, and it just looks completely ugly. And they don't really have this in Europe, not nearly as much, at least. Obviously, there's some versions of it, but I think America does this best, and we can all agree that America does this advertising in your face stuff best because, America is bigger and better. Also, cities are more walkable in Europe and most other places, so more activity does help regulate your weight. And the regulations between Europe and the United States are actually quite different. So we have pesticides and additives that are added to our food to enhance their flavor or make sure they have a longer shelf life or make it easier to farm. And so in the United States, ingredients are typically allowed until evidence is conclusive that they're harmful. And that is kind of scary to think about, because we're essentially allowing a lot of pesticides and artificial food dyes, like Red 40 as an example, in our food, just simply because the evidence isn't conclusive that it's harmful. We might have some studies that point to it being directly harmful, and we might have some studies that say that it's neutral, and we're still not banning it. In Europe, most ingredients are banned if it's just uncertain. And I think we should be following suit with what Europe is doing, because I think that's a much safer way to go about our health. Is if there's any uncertainty about how safe a substance is to be putting into our bodies, we should probably be on the safer side until it's fully conclusive that it is not harmful. So we just have really different, we have differences in tolerance and uncertainty risks between nations, which is really strange. And so ultimately, the European environment reduces friction for healthy behavior, making it easier. The American environment increases friction and then asks us individuals to compensate with willpower, which is not a very good formula if we're wanting to be concerned about our health, in my opinion. So getting into why fad diets exist, there's always going to be a fad diet, a new diet, a new food to avoid, a new food to incorporate into your diet. And this is kind of the reason why. There's no science behind this. This is just my observation from the last 10 years of my coaching practice and being heavily invested and informed in social media and the news regarding fitness and nutrition. So how fad diets form typically, and it's really important that you get this down because this will kind of equip you with the tools and weapons you need to fight against all this garbage that is on the internet, is number one, it forms from early research and overconfidence in that early research. So there is a whole hierarchy of scientific evidence I think everyone should know and learn. Essentially, just because a research paper online is posted through a credible source like PubMed or NCBI does not mean it is conclusive. You know, we can have one research paper, but that study might not have been conducted well. You know, the methods they used in the study were not great, and it also could not be replicable. So a lot of other laboratories might try and replicate the results in that study, and it was not replicated. And there's thousands of examples on this. So many different things in studies. Like a great example is aspartame as an example. You know, aspartame, I think we should avoid most artificial sweeteners in general or minimize it, but it's not nearly as bad as we thought it was. It's not nearly as carcinogenic as people thought, and people got really scared about this because we saw a study in mice that very, very, very high doses in mice could cause cancer, but it was not even applicable to humans. And so you'll see a lot of mechanistic or animal studies then be immediately applied to humans, which is just not the way that science works. That's one example of many. And so we have, you know, one paper that comes out that proves a diet like keto is extremely effective. People get really excited. They get overconfident in the results. And news and social media outlets will get excited for this because, again, in a capitalist environment, we're always seeking a competitive advantage. Again, I went to business school. The one thing that you've got to know in business school is you've got to have a competitive advantage. What are you better at than everyone else, right? What is your advantage over other companies? What are you better at? And how can you maintain that advantage? And so news and social media outlets, their advantage is unique news that people haven't heard before. And so they'll take, you know, a new paper that really isn't conclusive. They'll get excited about it and they'll post it for views and clicks because that's how they make their money. I like to think that not everyone is that greedy, but unfortunately, I think a lot of people are, or they're just misinformed and trying to do their job and they don't really have the resources or deadlines to work with to do it correctly. So people see initial success as a result of reading the news or seeing one of these research papers. And, you know, people will see success with these diets like carnivore or keto or whatnot. But it's really important to get down that the reason people see success with these diets, even though they might not be as efficient as a well-balanced diet, it's mainly due to generic dietary restrictions, not the diet itself. So people who get on keto or carnivore, they will probably see some weight loss and some results from that, which is great for them. However, it's because they're moving from an already disorganized diet where they're not being restrictive with their eating to then following a diet where they're paying attention to what they're eating and they're being restrictive and cutting out whole food groups. Obviously, that will lead to weight loss if you're going from unorganized eating to then organized eating. It's not that hard to understand. So once you start to see success, people will start to identify with the diet, right? Forming tribes around it. A great example of this, if you have the time, if you haven't heard of him, look up Liver King. Liver King is the saddest story I could think of. Last couple of years, he was essentially this phenom on the internet and social media who promoted ancestral eating like your ancestors, eating liver, eating, you know, animal organs because they are rich in nutrients. And that was kind of his main message for nutrition. Anyway, look up his story. It's a mess. This is a perfect example of this where they form tribes where people really follow a certain influencer or a certain ideology, you know, with paleo, keto, or carnivore, or, you know, Liver King as an example. And they'll start to be very loud and they'll start to be very overconfident and force their ideologies onto others. And eventually it falls apart in one way or another. With carnivore as an example, this started to fall apart as a lot of carnivore users or carnivore dieters started to get their blood work back and their LDL cholesterol was through the roof. A lot of them were actually getting cardiovascular disease. So it's not a joke. It really is sad to know that these people were just so misinformed and led the wrong way that they actually harmed their health at the end of the day. And this is why it's so important we don't get too excited or overconfident and stuff that we just don't know is conclusive. So other examples are like the Atkins diet. This turned into the keto diet, low fat, then low carb, then carnivore. And another one, which I think has some merit to it, are like ancestral diets. So eating how our ancestors ate, essentially, like paleo is a good example of that. It's still a bit too restrictive in my opinion. And it's not necessary to eat like our ancestors, because no, if you think about it, no one ancestral group around the world had access to all the healthy food. They were just limited to their geographical location in terms of what foods were immediately around them. I think the closest, best ancestral diet you could get is probably the Mediterranean diet, but there's even some foods in that I would suggest that you probably incorporate. So now we're no longer geographically limited to our diets. That's a benefit of modern technology in our economic system now, is that we can ship foods across the world, and we can now take all the healthiest foods from all of our ancestors and combine them. So I think there is some merit to an ancestral diet, but just not limiting it to one geographical location necessarily. So what is the cause of all this madness? Why is this happening? Why are there fad diets? Why is it so hard to eat in modern times? Why is there so much obesity? The root cause of it really is culture. And I had an amazing class in business school that taught me that culture really is the lens through which we see everything. Our culture, the people around you, your beliefs, your behaviors, your society that you're in, that all conditions your mind to like and believe things that you originally had no say in, right? You could be born into a capitalistic culture where you have this idea of survival of the fittest, and you can think that's a really good concept. And nothing is neither good or bad. There's just trade-offs to things, but in some cases, survival of the fittest is definitely not the best way to go. So going back to capitalism and consumerism, capitalism works really well until it doesn't. Capitalism is a merit-based system, essentially, that rewards individual efforts. It does not reward community efforts. And so that is very dangerous for the individual, because if you are unsuccessful in life, if you're unhappy, if you're not doing well, the capitalist system has taught you that it is entirely your fault. Entirely, right? So if you're not doing well, you're unsuccessful, you simply need to work harder. No matter what your environment was, your circumstances, it's your fault. You need to take ownership and responsibility of it. And there's a good message in there, but it's not all good. And so this capitalist mindset can be very helpful. It leads to great technological advancement. It solves a lot of diseases and cures. But I think, again, there's trade-offs to it. And it's especially harmful to young adults who can't filter information. Some phrases that kind of stem from the capitalistic mindset, or blue sky thinking is what it's called, is early bird gets the worm, more is better, sleep when you're dead, survival of the fittest. And you might seem these are extreme or silly now, but to a developing young adult, it doesn't seem silly. They take it seriously. This is kind of the same boat I fell into when I went to the University of Michigan. I really took these messages to heart. And a lot of successful people told me that you got to just work your butt off. And it is a good thing to work your butt off, but there's a balance to it, and I think everyone should be able to find that own balance for themselves. And so humans are very psychologically very, very vulnerable, and I don't really have a solution here, but some starters would be to restrict marketing to children. I think that makes a lot of sense. Why are we marketing food products and products in general to still developing minds? We should label ultra processed foods clearly, have a government mandated label on these processed foods that we know are bad for us, subsidize whole foods to make them cheaper, more accessible, or regulate company marketing so they're not so meticulously, obviously crafted to manipulate your psychology and your behavior. There's a picture I have here from a movie called, I believe, They Live. And this was a movie that stuck with me since business school for my entire life. At this point, I think about it so often. It's this idea of this person who wears glasses, and every time he puts on the glasses, he kind of sees the truth of the world. So there's aliens, of course. I'm not really concerned about that part of the movie. But every time he put on the glasses, he would see all the advertisements and billboards for their actual message behind it. So whatever advertisement it was, he put on the glasses, and the advertisements would start saying things like consume, buy, conform, obey, watch television, stay asleep. And this is a very extreme example, but I think there is some merit to this, to know that every advertisement was meticulously crafted to get a desired response from you. And this is very apparent in business school. Not every company is like this. I think there's some companies out there that truly have our best interests at heart, but most advertisements were designed so carefully, so meticulously to get you to buy the product. And so this leads to a predictable progression of capitalist-centered nutritional mindsets or ideologies, right? So it's a very predictable progression where one, convenience starts to increase. Capitalism solves the problem of taking too long to prepare food, or it's too costly to buy food. Your effort then decreases. You then don't put in as much effort to making your own food. Satiety signals weaken because you're leaning on processed foods that don't fill you up. Consumption rises because you don't know how to feel full. You're not getting full and you want more. 5, your health declines as a result. 6, the individual or you are blamed as a result of this system. And then 7, the industry itself profits. And then as long as the industry profits, as long as the GDP goes up, as long as the economics goes up and it's beneficial, it then rewards the system and it's a continuous vicious cycle. So the problem is not really bad people making bad choices. It's really systems rewarding bad outcomes. And so what do we actually know about nutrition? Here are some evidence-based guidelines that I would really start following today. These are immediately applicable. So number 1, of course, as we've been discussing, none to minimal processed foods. Eat mainly single ingredient whole foods. 2 is eat adequate protein and fiber. A good rule of thumb here is 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories. For protein, eat 0.8 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And protein, 0.8 is kind of the minimum recommended daily allowance for your body to function well and live a long time. You can scale that up to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight if you're concerned about preserving muscle mass, which I think everyone should be concerned with preserving muscle mass, because one of the biggest contributors of decreased health span is muscle wasting with age, which is otherwise known as sarcopenia. So people will fall and break their bones really easily because they're not strong enough. Third rule is to limit saturated fat intake to less than 10% of your calories. So just really limit any sort of animal-based fats, so fatty meats, dairy, butter, and opt for plant-based fats instead. Minimize fried foods, especially just fried foods are terrible for you. Tons of saturated fats. And the heating process of the oil itself creates trans fats, which are especially bad for you. And it creates versions of fats that are molecularly unstable, which actually damage your cells and cause chronically inflamed states and actually mutate your genes, which is not great to put in your body, in my opinion. And in general, just eat single ingredient whole foods majority of the time. Lots of plants, lots of lean meats. Salt, minimize your seasonings to salt, pepper, spices, and herbs, and really minimize dressing and oils. You really want to minimize dressing and oils because oils are and dressings are so high in fat that like 1 tablespoon of olive oil is about 100 calories. And you can put that in your mouth, swallow it, and you feel like you ate nothing, but it was 100 calories, and it's so easy to overdo that. It overrides your satiety signals. Because remember, oil is technically group 2, step down on the processed food list, according to that food classification system. And I want you to notice the word minimize here. The best thing about this is that you can still have any food you want in moderation. I say just keep your food 80% of the time to that group number 1 in the food classification system. Lots of plants, lots of lean meats. There's no weird banned food rules, such as with keto or paleo, where you're cutting out entire food groups. You can still keep in foods that you like as long as it's within moderation. One thing that's important to know is you have to avoid overeating, but also undereating, right? Too much of anything is going to be bad for you. Don't gain more than 2 to 4 pounds per month because that can lead to insulin resistance over time. It essentially just elevates blood sugar levels and causes inflammation. It's chronic overconsumption, chronic eating. And don't lose more than 4 to 6 pounds per month for longer than like 6 months at a time. Reasons for this is metabolic downregulation occurs when you lose weight too quickly. Your thyroid will actually start to decrease output of thyroid hormones, slowing your bodily functions, slowing your organs down, slowing your heart rates. Your energy will decrease, your sex drive and libido will increase, your motivation will decrease, which is not great. So you just want to find foods that are single ingredient whole foods, have a good ratio of macronutrients, 33% protein, 33% carbs, 33% fats. If you ever tracked your calories, that's a really great well-balanced diet to follow. You just want foods that have tons of micronutrients and then lots of antioxidants, lots of vitamins, lots of minerals. That really stems from just, again, whole foods, lots of plants, fruits, meats, vegetables. Meal timing and meal frequency really does not matter. You can choose 1 meal per day. You can choose 5 meals per day. Whatever works best with your schedule, follow that. It really does not matter when you look at long-term data on how obesity forms, how metabolic health works. This only really matters if you're an athlete and you're trying to optimize your physical performance in a certain sport. There's a whole discussion and nuance to that, but for general health purposes, you can follow whatever diet you want. Your body will adapt to it and get very proficient at that diet in terms of meal timing or frequency. So Why are these the evidence-based recommendations? Processed food-wise, it's because they lack macronutrients. Again, going back to the idea that we want to eat foods that neutralize the damage that occurs when we eat. We want to avoid foods that are just empty calories. They're easily overconsumed. They're harmful to the microbiome. There are artificial sweeteners in there and the chemicals in there. Everything is a chemical, but you know what I mean in this case. Are harmful to the gut. They kill off gut bacteria that's very beneficial for our health, and it's irritating to the gut. Processed foods are typically harder to break down mechanically for the gut than it is for natural foods to be broken down. Why high protein? Protein has a very strong satiating effect compared to carbs or fats. It really suppresses our appetite and signals to our brain that we're full. It also preserves muscle mass. Fiber, it slows digestion, and it clears LDL cholesterol, it stabilizes blood sugar, it reduces cancer risk, which is very, very helpful. Saturated fats, we want to limit those because it's directly correlated to cardiovascular disease. It is very well proven in the research. We should just be really limiting our saturated fats. It's not great for us. It does lead to heart problems and increases in cholesterol and in our arteries and veins. And there's little fat buildup deposits that form on our arteries and can cause a heart attack or poor circulation. Not great. And why single ingredient whole foods? Because they take a long time to chew and digest. And this allows for satiation. The longer you chew something and the longer it takes to digest, the more satiating it will feel to the brain biologically. And so that stabilizes blood sugar as well. And it's important to note here that barriers to eating are okay and they're natural. Think back again to our first example at the beginning of this podcast. Historically, what was food like? What was eating like historically? It was hard to prepare. It was effortful to make and to find. It's okay if you can't have your typical breakfast or lunch on a certain day. Try to get back into a normal routine when you can. But barriers to eating are okay. It's meant to be a bit difficult. That's the point. That's how we developed. We evolved in a food scarce environment. And so it's really important to understand that you're going to survive if you have to miss your meal. If you like fasting because preparing food is too bad for you, one meal a day might be a very great approach for you. And you simply just need to load up on electrolytes earlier on in the day with like Element or making your own salt and lime drink just to keep blood volume stable. Make sure that you're not getting lightheaded, stuff like that. So that's what we did historically. I think it makes a lot of sense if we continue replicating that. And overall, our goal is to minimize sharp increases and decreases in blood sugar and to reduce inflammation as a result. And if you really don't have time to make real food ever, even with one meal a day, it's questionable. And I think your priorities might be a bit backwards. It's not your fault, but I think you might have fell down the consumerist rabbit hole down a bit too far. You've said yes to too many things. You're working on too many projects. You're trying to make too much money, trying to accumulate too many things. Maybe scale down your means of living, say no to things, draw some more clear boundaries of work. It's, again, not your fault, but I would start digging out of that consumerist rabbit hole when you can. It's a whole other conversation, much easier said than done. But it is something I would consider. So if I were to call this a diet, the guidelines that we just laid out, I'd call it the Earth Diet. Eating food that came from the ground or had a mom and dad. If you follow that rule and you cook those foods and prepare it yourself, you're going to have such an easy time regulating your weight. I promise you. And once you see past all of the fake food, nutrition really is simple. Eat real food and the body will regulate itself extremely well. Levels of obesity we see today are only possible with modern foods and processed foods. You cannot get to 300, 400 pounds with straight vegetables and meat. You're just going to get tired of that food. There are some disorders that might, counteract or contradict that statement, but almost nobody will overeat carrots, strawberries, and fish. You can have all of the, plants, vegetables, fruits, and lean meats pull up in truckloads to your house right now for the next month of your life. And you might eat more plants and meats, but you're definitely not going to get too overweight as you would if there were a bunch of processed foods. And so I think a really important concept to think about is we are the only species who eats delicious concoctions of food daily. No other animal has a hard time maintaining their weight in the wild. And this is an extreme example. We're not animals, but no other animal is putting seasoning on their food and developing these concoctions that are super delicious. Obviously, most of them aren't smart to do that anyway. But just goes to show that when in a proper environment, getting overweight is almost impossible. 7 ideal daily food groups. This is a evidence-based kind of list that I would start incorporating into your diet daily to really optimize your health. I was about to call these superfoods, but I don't like the term superfoods. It's a great picture here. Superfoods is really a marketing term to describe foods that are high in certain nutrients. The term superfoods helps to just sell books, create headlines, sell these foods. It's just a capitalistic tendency. So superfoods really don't have any additional benefits over other foods necessarily. More is usually not better. And, general advice is just eat fruit and vegetables, eat varied, eat the rainbow, do all the guidelines that we discussed. However, there are 7 food groups that if you do lean into your diet daily, you will see actual beneficial improvements, because we do have clinical studies of people incorporating these foods into their life, into their diet, and actually see significant health improvements just from this one change alone in their diet. Number 1 is cruciferous vegetables. Very beneficial for your health. They're very rich, like things like kale, broccoli, cauliflower. They're very rich in vitamins and minerals. They seem to have a unique cancer-fighting benefit as well, and they do help modulate levels of estrogen in the body. So this is great for women trying to regulate their menstrual cycle. It's also great for men, because men also need estrogen as well. I don't know why we seem to ignore estrogen in men, but we do and often overlook it. Number 2 are berries, especially things like blueberries. Blueberries seem to have a very unique polyphenol, which is a antioxidant in the skin called anthocyanins that really help with inflammation and improve cognitive function. Nuts, any sort of form of nut is really great for your health. The unsaturated fats in there, really great for cardiovascular health and brain health and lowering inflammation. Extra virgin olive oil, again, opting toward plant-based fats, far better than animal-based fats. Extra virgin olive oil specifically has higher amounts of polyphenols, antioxidants, phytonutrients that are more beneficial than regular olive oil or other forms of seed oils. It's not a seed oil, but other forms of plant-based oils. Lean proteins also, again, helps preserve muscle mass, keeps you satiated for longer. Green tea or coffee, any sort of herbal tea or coffee bean, very high in antioxidants, polyphenols. And again, going back to our original goal with nutrition is to eat foods and consume things that have these antioxidants and phytonutrients in them to combat the stressors of life and combat the stressors of eating. Very beneficial to have those in your diet. Also, caffeine and coffee seem to have a exciting effect on the nervous system and the brain, which can help preserve cognitive function and reaction time and cognition over time. And finally, fermented foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, yogurts, anything that has a probiotic, a natural probiotic in it. You can take probiotic pills, but in my opinion, the research isn't as conclusive for probiotic pills yet, because some people will need certain strains of probiotics, and it's very random which ones will benefit you. It's very specific to you, because your microbiome and the gut bacteria that you are affected by literally your lifestyle, what you eat, what pets you have, even where you live, what people you're around, what exercise you do. And so it's very individual. A certain probiotic pill only has a few different strains, whereas fermented foods will have a lot of different strains that are very diverse. So things like kimchi, sauerkraut, yogurts, again, will help proliferate more bacteria in the gut and improve the intestinal health by increasing integrity of those cells along the intestinal barrier. So it improves function, improves the mechanical integrity of the gut, and can help improve the gut bacteria health and diversity itself. So applying the science, practical strategies to start applying this immediately. Number 1, I'm going to take a lot of these examples straight from James Clear, who is a behavioral scientist. He wrote the book Atomic Habits. If you haven't given him a read, highly recommend you look him up. Give the Atomic Habits book a read. Number 1, make whole foods visible and convenient. Make sure that you're using the same tricks that marketers and grocery stores use on yourself. Place your vegetables and your meats eye level. Hide all of the processed foods and snacks you have in your house. Make them very inconvenient to reach or get. Remove or limit trigger foods from the home. For me, this is such a non-negotiable for me. I cannot keep processed foods in the house. I do not have the willpower to say no. I was raised as a kid in my childhood, we'd always have access to food in the cabinets or snacks. And so nowadays I require a lot of mental intensity and focus to say no to foods that are immediately in my vicinity. And in my opinion, anyway, your kitchen, your home should not be a place where you have to express immense amounts of willpower or discipline. Save that for when you're out and about. Your life is already hard. It's already complicated. You don't need to be having a mental battle of whether or not to have another Oreo out of the cabinet, okay? Number 3 is simplify meals into repeatable templates. I'm sorry, chefs, for those of you who really like making new recipes and making new concoctions. As long as, you can make healthy recipes, but for those of you that make very grandiose, elaborate recipes, sorry, but eating should not be this large task that we have to think about. Again, life is already complicated enough. We don't need to be wasting our decision fatigue and our mental energy on what to make. Make meals that you know digest well, that feel good to you, that meet your macronutrient and energy demands, and just stick with it most of the time. 89% of the time, just have those be your meals that you go to on a weekly and daily basis. Meals and food should be functional, not an entertainment source most of the time. Grocery shop with rules, not emotion. Have a system, have a go-to route you take in the grocery store. Have a list that you always go by. Again, if you're going to make simplify a repeatable templates for your meals, that means you're going to have a repeatable grocery list. Keep it simple, keep it easy. Try to go to the grocery store full and not hungry, hopefully, and avoid looking at all the stuff that's eye level, hopefully. Eat boring most of the time. So the decision fatigue disappears. You want to really just eat bland, boring foods most of the time. It should not be exciting. It should not be entertaining. You shouldn't be looking forward to food. Hopefully, there are more amazing, cool things in life that you can focus on. I promise you. And be aware of habit-formed relationships with food. So a lot of us will develop subconscious emotional attachments to food. I am very much one of those people. It's very important that you are aware of these. Examples of this are, for me, after my client calls in my coaching practice, I'll be very present. I'll be very intense during my calls. It's like very emotionally intense for me because I want to be present for that individual and really make sure I'm there and giving them the best advice possible. And so immediately after the call, I'll kind of have a down period where I kind of feel like a lethargic and like lower in energy just because I just expended a lot of energy for 30 minutes to an hour talking to this person. And I'll typically opt for some food or a snack because I'm feeling there's like an emotional gap. My dopamine levels are probably decreasing. I'm getting tired and my body wants to compensate with that by replacing that energy with food. And so that's kind of a subconscious habit that I've made that I have to be very aware of and start replacing the food that I have or reach out for maybe like tea or coffee or a piece of gum. Another habit that I think most of us have developed subconsciously is like weekends. We subconsciously just let loose on the weekends. We're very flexible. We'll have a cheat meal. We'll go out to dinner. Be conscious of that. What are you doing with your environment and what steps lead to you having that cheat meal just to make sure you're not going overboard with it. Just be very aware. Finally, give change time. This is going to take time to transition into this way of eating. It's not going to be easy, especially, again, you live in the United States. You're going to be forced. There's going to be so many advertisements and food products forced in your face all the time. It's going to remind you of your old ways. It's very hard. It really is. So give it time, especially when transitioning from a hyper palatable diet to a very tasty diet with a lot of culinary dishes, processed foods. You're going to likely feel irritated or have strong cravings at first. And eating well will feel harder at first, but your brain does get adapted to it. And eventually you will actually feel better just because it improves your metabolic health, improves your brain health. But initially there might be some irritation because your body and brain has gotten adapted to these super tasty foods and it wants those to fill the void. And so especially if you're overweight or have any sort of metabolic dysregulation, this will feel harder. Things like leptin resistance. People who are obese develop leptin resistance. Leptin is a hormone secreted by fat cells that help your brain signal to you that you're full. And when you have too many fat cells producing too much leptin, you eventually become resistant to that signal. Dopamine downregulation. So if you're eating really, really tasty foods, really good foods, that'll increase your dopamine and make bland foods like vegetables or meat taste even worse or more bland. So over time, whole foods do actually taste better to you because your dopamine does resensitize to itself. Your brain gets adapted to it. And insulin resistance, so erratic blood sugar. This can cause erratic blood sugar and kind of make your mood a little bit more erratic and energy more erratic, which can be hard to stay disciplined and have willpower with your food. Just really, again, try to lean on making your environment, especially at home, as easy as you possibly can. Do not make your home a place where you have to express immense amounts of willpower. And finally, a last little note that I'd like to discuss briefly are GLP-1 medications. So things like Ozempic, tirzepatide, semaglutide, because they are very popular nowadays. I think they have their use cases. However, you should be very careful with how you implement them if you choose to do so. They are not a long-term solution. They can absolutely help people get back on track with their health. And I think people who have gone too far, are very overweight, obese, maybe 290 pounds or above, might very well benefit from using GLP-1 medication initially because of the aforementioned leptin resistance, insulin resistance that comes as a result. Because believe it or not, the more overweight you get, your body gets good at staying overweight. Whatever you train your body to do, it gets really efficient at doing that. So that also happens with exercise. You get good at cardiovascular exercise. You get good at staying fit. With obesity, your body gets really good at staying obese. And so GLP-1 medications can help start getting you heading in the right direction. And what GLP-1 medications do is they slow gastric emptying and digestion, so it helps food move through your digestive system slower. So that will obviously help you stay more full because you have receptors in your gut and intestines that help signal to your brain that you're full. It reduces appetite by acting on neurons and receptors in the brain. So GLP-1 itself attaches to receptors in the brain that help you feel full and reduce food-seeking behavior, and actually reduces food noise. This is a major benefit. A lot of people will report on GLP-1 medications is they don't think about food nearly as often. That's a problem that I had when I was approaching 300 pounds earlier in my life. I would often think about food, and it took a long time to undo that, a long time. And still comes back to me every now and again. And so that's a major benefit that can help you get on the right track. But GLP-1 medications do not magically burn more calories. It literally just suppresses your appetite and your food thoughts. That's pretty much all it does. It does improve insulin sensitivity, which can help, but that's not going to help you burn more calories magically. And so this will fail if you do not have a good dietary foundation. You cannot get on GLP-1 medication without having dietary intervention. If you continue to eat poorly, eating the same foods that got you to the weight that you are now, and you hop on GLP-1 medication, you're simply just going to start eating less of the foods that you already eat. And as soon as you get off the GLP-1 medication, you're just going to eat more again, and you're going to get right back to where you started. So it's really important that you take all of the aforementioned evidence-based guidelines and you really apply them as you get on GLP-1 medication, because it's not a long-term solution. Otherwise, that is all I have for this episode. Thank you very much for listening, getting this far. Please, at this early stage, please share, like, and subscribe. Share this with a friend or family member that you think would be very beneficial for. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.